brain.
Okay, folks. Hi. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. My name is Kelly. I am the Cultural Heritage Knowledge Series Coordinator here at the Fort Frances Library. And this is the first event in our Cultural Heritage Knowledge Series, our book launch with Shaun and Jim, Shaun, Loney, and Jim Leonard here. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to you guys. Thank you.
Hello, good evening. As Kelly said, my name is Jim Leonard. I'm from Manitou Rapids, just west of BMO. And this is a project that's something I've always wanted to do all my life, right since days when I went to school at Donald Young. And back then I realized that there was nothing in the history books about emo or Fort Frances or the Rainy River in particular. You know, we heard about La Vérendrye going by here, you know, in the 1600s, but that's all it said. There was nothing anywheres. And that really bothered me. You know, all my life, I've always wanted, and I've told people, I've told authors and stuff that I've met that, you know, that was my lifelong goal, is to have something written about the district. And one day, 5 or 6 years ago, I was in Emo buying groceries, and I met Shaun, and we got to talking, and one thing led to another, and this started along our journey of writing this book. And what I wanted to do then is tell stories about the river, you know, tell stories about the district, because we, you know, I hear, you know, little stories here and there about the fire that burst in the 1900s, you know, the town of Baudette burning down, and you know, but nothing ever really and to put things together. So I was hoping by doing this, you know, we could give a better understanding to ourselves, to learn about, you know, about our shared history, and even for the kids to learn. From the beginning, I talked to Shaun about, let's try to make this book as easy to read as possible, so that the 80-year-old guy in Stratton, farmer, could understand it, and the grade 7 or 8 kid going to school could understand it, and something that, you know, they could sit down and look at. And when we had the first draft out, I read it and I couldn't put it down. I sat there for a couple hours to go through it, and it's, you know, it's 100 or so pages, but you can go get through it fairly quickly. It maybe take 2 or 3 hours, and you can go through it. Some of the things in there, you know, the stories about, you know, about my personal upbringing, and you know, a story that's, you know, I always tell to people is that I grew up along the river. My family was very, very poor, and we really didn't have that much to live on. And my father was a fisherman, and he would fish for sturgeon in the river. And he'd do, but some of the older people can remember this, we'd string out all line and put a big anchor at the end of it and tie, you know, 100 or so hooks on it. And we'd have to bait it with sucker meat or crayfish. But sturgeon used to like the crayfish. And I can remember me and my sister, every day we'd have to walk up and down the river on the rocks and catching crayfish. And we'd have to do this every day, all summer long, and, you know, to catch the fish. And that gave me a certain dislike for fishing and hunting, because if I didn't go out and get a partridge or a duck or a fish, we wouldn't eat. And growing up and living that way for the first 10 or 15 years. And today, you know, people say, you know, are you going fishing or are you going hunting? And I say, no, you know. And I own a piece of property on Clearwater, and I think I'm the only Indian in Canada that takes fish to the lake instead of bringing fish back. So, you know, those are kind of the little stories that we talk about. Another thing that really surprised me is when we talk about the Métis and Couchiching, the Métis the amalgamation there. And the story behind that is that, which I knew before, is that the chief of Long Sioux, which was Mawandopenas, and he's part of the Rainy River First Nations Manitou band, and the chief of Couchiching at the time. When the treaty was signed, there was a lot of people living along the river, and they realized that they had forgotten those people that lived along the river. So the two chiefs got together and decided, what are we going to do with these? So the chief of Couchiching at the time said, I'll take them. So he took those people from the river and negotiated with Canada the adhesion to Treaty Number 3. And so Canada at the time decided that they were going to set up a Métis reserve, strictly for the Métis people. And that was the plan. But when they got back to Ottawa and they're talking, that they were given rights to the Métis people in general. And that's why Louis Riel and the big uprising with Louis Riel, because he was trying to fight for the rights that they had given the Couchiching people, so that the Métis were never actually granted that status. And at about the same time, which was very interesting to me, and I talked to Stacy about this number of times, just west of Winnipeg on Lake Winnipeg, there's a settlement of people from Iceland, and they had a reserve similar to what the Métis did. And when all, they were setting up reserve, they were giving the people from Iceland a reserve like an Indian reserve, and like what they did to Métis. But when they found out that they were opening up a big can of worms, they shut it all down. So, that's an interesting story that, that resulted from, the adhesion at Couchiching. And so that's things like that that really, really interested me. Another one is that we were, when we were writing the book, we were traveling around the sites along the river, both the American side and the Canadian side. And we were at Oak Grove Camp, and Shaun and Mike were camping there. And a beautiful camp, and I know many of you have probably been there. It's beautiful there. And Shaun says to me, he says, this used to be a reserve? And I said, yeah. And he says, are you upset that you don't have this land? And I looked at him kind of funny, and I said, no, why should I be upset? They're taking really, really good care of it. So I'm happy that they're taking good care of it. And he couldn't understand why I felt that way, because he felt that the band should own that land and be the ones taking care of it. But I said, no, it's being taken care of. And I'm really happy and proud of the owner for doing that. So, that's just my personal thing, and the way First Nations people feel about the land. If it's being taken care of, we're really happy. It doesn't matter who owns it, because in our culture, nobody owns the land. It's here to for us to take care of. So that's just some of the stories that are near and dear to me. Like I said, I hate fishing. I hate shooting ducks. I don't think in my younger days, I'd kill hundreds and hundreds of partridge, and today I don't think I could I don't even own a gun. I used to own 20, 30 guns, but today I'd rather take a picture of them than shoot an animal. But that's just how I feel. And there's so many stories that we talked about along this, and I think Shaun is going to highlight some of them. So I'll just pass it on to Shaun. Shaun?
Thank you. As for the first draft, Jim was very kind, and he read it over, and he told me, he says, Shaun, I know that you feel things have been unfair, but this book needs a little more cowboy and a little less Indian. So the tone of the book is really from Jim. It's very balanced. And we wrote a book really about a lot of things that we didn't know about. So a couple things that I want to say. I need your help with something. And the first thing is we need to help everyone in the area. I'm talking Minnesota and on our side as well, how to pronounce the name of the book correctly. And my partner Fiona's here. and her son speaks Ojibwe. And so I've got him recorded, and I hope that this is going to work. So we're just going to give this a try.
Manitou Ziibi is the card that you Ziibi. So I did say, call it Manitou Ziibi is how it sounds.
You all got it now, right? So it's Manidoo Ziibi, Manidoo Ziibi. It looks like you might say Manidoo, but it's properly pronounced Manidoo. So I could use your help in making sure that we're pronouncing. This is what the Ojibwe called the river, and so that was we didn't set out to write a book with that title, but it quickly became the title as we're kind of reclaiming some history that we all share here. So that's number one thing. Pardon me? Manidoo Ziibi means spirit river. And thank you, left that out. Second thing I wanted to say, some of you will be familiar with these types of books. I would call them settler history books. We got as many of these as we could from around, and buried in here is some pretty interesting history. There's 5 people that were chiefly responsible for writing this book, and 2 of them were my grandparents, my mom's dad and my dad's mom. And they put a lot of love and care into collecting these stories that are in here, but it's very much settler history, and it's not much here about Indigenous history. And so as Jim said, that this book is really about our shared history. So we're really looking for stories that explain how it is that we got to where we are. So I feel like my grandparents are here, and they're proud that there's been an appendum to this book for at least those of us living in Emo, and these settler books are all around. Now we've got quite a few people on Zoom, and so I'm showing them some pictures as well, and you can maybe follow along in the book if you've got a copy of them. The book, by the way, is owned by Keinachi Winong, so the Mounds, and they're very generously paid for the whole thing. And Jim and I donated our time. It took a lot longer than either one of us thought it might, but they'll put the money from the sales of the books into more educational opportunities. So it's really kind of Rainy River First Nations to do that. And I wanted to acknowledge that up front as well. This guy's in the book as well. You might be able to see his picture parked. This is Drayden, and I'm his uncle. And he is in on the sand at Sand Islands, which is the delta of the Rainy River. You can see his picture in the book. So the book it's place-based. So sometimes when you're reading history books, it goes by time, and this book doesn't go by time. It goes by place. So we start on the causeway, which is where the water is gathering up to come down the river. And that idea was from my buddy Mike, who's sitting in the front here. And Mike helped do a lot of the writing in the book. And he used to work for the Tribune. Do you remember the Tribune? He's that old. Like he gathered the stories in the Tribune a long time ago. And I told Mike, we had 50 stories written up, and you drive around the river and you could see where these 50 stories happened. And Mike said, I don't really like that 50 stories. Can we do something about that? And I said, no, you're working for us. You do the 50 stories. He said, well, you sure? I said, Mike, I don't want to hear any more about it. And he came back and didn't pay any attention to me at all, and kind of put the 50 stories into 4 one-day journeys. So it's pretty cool. North, south, east, west, and you're going around the river in the direction of the Ojibwe. The Ojibwe go clockwise. So that was a Mike-ism, even though I was really pissed off with him when he didn't listen to, but I immediately saw the wisdom of it. It's fantastic. And he took some of the great pictures in the book as well. And you can see in the back of the book who took the pictures or where the pictures came from. So if you see a fantastic picture, you can have a look at it. and see where they came from. So the book is not a history of the Rainy River First Nations. It is not a settler history. It is not a Métis history. It's really a storybook, and you can tell by looking at us, neither one of us are academics or historians. So if you're wondering about a particular detail, we've been pretty careful in the book to just say where we're getting the information from, and you can go back and find it. So some stories that I wanted to highlight that kind of surprised me, which is kind of sad, actually, I think in some ways, that I just didn't know. And one of them is about the Indian residential school on page 17, if you're following in the book. And I saw a reference that Sherry George had given me something from the library that said that 42 kids had died at the residential school. And this is before the bodies were found in BC and Saskatchewan. And so that's an evolving story, but my goodness, you send kids to school. And we found some amazing quotes from Indian agents that were trying to alert the government of Canada to the horrible conditions that were at the school. And so you can read some of that. And then a very hopeful twist, which is the Seven Gens College, very close, very nearby. And on page 18, you'll see an amazing picture of a willow in the graveyard that Mike took that picture. And next, I wanted to show you something else that really surprised me, which is on page 24. And this is an old burial mound at the point. And if you look on the picture very closely, you'll see there's a door on the burial mound. And that is Mr. Pither, we always call it Pither's Point Park, turned the burial mound into a root cellar. And it obviously bothered a lot of people that the park was named after someone that was in that way disrespectful. But interestingly, he was at the Treaty 3 negotiations. And a couple of years after Treaty 3 was signed, this Simon Dawson was paddling by, coming past the point, and saw, holy crap, this Robert Pither has homesteaded on the land that was to go to the Ojibwe, that was negotiated in Treaty 3. And he actually wrote a letter to the Minister of Indian Affairs to alert the government that there was an immediate violation of Treaty 3 from someone who was there negotiating Treaty 3. Now, he was expropriated from the park by the government of Canada, but we all grew up Pither's Point Park. Well, if you're Ojibwe living in the area, that's a bit of an eye poker. And so that's why all these signs you see in the bottom left of the picture of the page on page 24, that the chief of Couchiching First Nation asked the mayor of the town of Fort Frances, can you just cover up as an immediate show of respect the word Pither from everywhere? And so I think that's quite interesting. For folks on Zoom, I don't know where it is in the book, but I've got a picture of my dad at Pither's Point Park. And he is just a little kid. And he would be 90 if he were alive today. And my grandfather also went to Pither's Point Park. And I asked Jim earlier, did you go to Pither's Point Park when you were a kid? And he didn't. They didn't have the cash to even travel to Fort Frances. And so I didn't know that was a reserve. I had no idea until a few years ago. So we tell that story as well. Page 26 is a picture of the Calder sign. The Calder being a Métis name. And that was a really important that the town acknowledged the presence of the Métis in the area. Métis have had and have troubles fitting in because they're not Ojibwe and they're not settler. And so we try to tell that story. And Jim mentioned about the only Métis reserve ever in Canada being what is now the south end of Couchiching First Nation. Something else that absolutely I was just amazing to me these Dawson locks on page 35. They were trying to get settlers from Lake Superior to the west as quickly as possible. And what was happening is the settlers were going through the states and getting off in the states and ending up settling there. Plus, the government of Canada wanted to get the army through quickly. So they were trying to build a road from Fort William, Port Arthur, all the way to what is now Winnipeg, Upper Fort Garry. And in order to make that smoother, they blasted the rocks right here in Fort Francis at the Couchiching Falls. And so whenever we're going over to International Falls, we go over these locks. And it was at the time the biggest boondoggle in the history of Canada, huge debate in Parliament. And they needed just a little wee bit of money to put the doors on the locks. And the government said, no, that's enough. We're not spending any more. And so there they are. And that'd be pretty cool, I think, for us to have our own locks in the area once again, especially as the mill is going to give us access to the river, the removal of the mill. So I think that is very interesting and was a surprise. I mean, how many times had I driven over there and I didn't know that? Is anyone else not know about the Dawson locks, or was that just me? You all knew about the Dawson locks. Give me a break. Okay. I know Sherry George was surprised by that. Okay, page 40. There is a picture of Edward Backus, whom we've all heard of before. And, sorry, page 43. I want you to go to page 43. So there's two dudes on there, Backus and then Holzer. I've never heard of Holzer either. And the picture there is he's with this Ojibwe guy named Billy McGee. And Holzer could speak Ojibwe because of a big canoe trip they took up the Hudson's Bay, and they came back down, and they're chronicling Indigenous culture. And Holzer lived in the U.S. on a rainy lake on a 2-acre island, very small island. And he learned on his trip how Ojibwe or Indigenous worldview was so different than Western worldview. It was like integrating nature and not dominating it. And he heard about Backus' plan to put the numbers in here, 26 hydro dams between here and Fort William. And they were going to build, they were going to log the whole area in the same way that the area was being logged here. And Holzer didn't like that. So he went down to Minneapolis and signed up the Pillsburys, who didn't like Backus, got the money and took him on in court and stopped Backus. And Backus went bankrupt largely because of it. And what happened was the creation of Quetico Park and the Boundary Waters canoe area as a result of all that activism that sort of centered around Backus's activities here. So something else I had absolutely no idea about. Page 49, if you're following along. I did not know, and I think Jim did not know. I don't think anybody knew. And would be surprised if anyone knew in the district at all. We came along across these maps, and we were trying to find out what happened to the Minnesota Ojibwe. I mean, they didn't just decide to live on the south shore of the Rainy River. They were also, or on the north shore, they were also on the south shore. Well, when we dug into it, the entire south shore of the Rainy River and the entire south shore of Lake of the Woods was reserve land. International Falls was a reserve, is on what was reserve land. And so we tell that story on page 49. And what happened to the Ojibwe. And we are, the river, by the way, and this book is reconnecting us to the Minnesota Ojibwe. And we are going to do some book launches, we hope, in Minnesota. And there's some suggestions for trips here as you're traveling around as well. Now, something else I found interesting on page So I think we'll come back to that. Page 51 at the Little Fork, what was the Little Fork First Nation. And for those on Zoom, you can see this, there's 7 different First Nations. I did not know that there were 7 First Nations on the Rainy River on the Canadian side. I didn't know that until I read it in the paper 7 or 8 years ago, or whenever the settlement was. And it seems like something we should be teaching our kids because it's our shared history. But really interesting to me was where the Little Fork River dumps into the Rainy on the Canadian side, that was a First Nation. And J.A. Matthew ended up owning that land, and he called it the Bonnie View. And he never spent a night there, but it was quite the spectacular place with one heck of a view of the mouth of the Little Fork River. And so I found that to be quite interesting, something that I didn't know. There's a great picture on page 53 of the Grand Mound after the grass had been burned. Page 57. I'm sorry for the folks on Zoom. The pictures are a little bit out of order, but you'll get the gist. On page 57 is a picture of a steamboat. So we kind of tell the stories of the steamboat on the river. And I'd heard this from my grandpa too, is that when the steamboats were coming up, the Indians, as my grandpa said, would run out and they would actually help pull the steamships up the rapids, and they would drop 100-pound sack of flour off for the assistance. And we talk about that relationship as well. And you'll notice that this steamship, and we've all seen pictures of this particular steamship, is called Aguinde, which is probably not pronounced correctly, but it's kind of a different word for us if we only speak English. Well, it means it floats in Ojibwe. So my stepson, Fiona's son, was telling us that it means it floats. So I found that pretty interesting. Okay, on page 74, this is fascinating too. So if you go right down to the mouth of the Rainy River on the Canadian side, and I would encourage you to go on the American side too, to Wheeler's Point, and we tell that whole story. You come back, go over the Baudette Bridge, and then you can go back towards the Lake of the Woods. And so on page 74 is a picture of the 3 Rainy River First Nations that were down there: Pasconkin, the Bishop, and the Wildlands Reserve. Well, there's still road signs that say Wildland Reserve down there, and it's really beautiful, but it was all expropriated. And that's where Jim was talking about that Mike and I were camping when we were doing our research on page 74. And then moving along, there's Drayden on page 80. And oh yes, Boucherville Road. We've driven by, you see it in Stratton. There's a Boucherville Creek just east of Emo. Louis Riel's father was on the Rainy River, and Louis Riel's grandmother's maiden name was Boucher or Boucher. So we're talking about connections from the Rainy River to one of the most famous Canadians, Louis Riel. And so you might enjoy looking at that as well. And finally, something that really struck me, and it's hard to pull just certain stories out, but is the friendship fish fry that the Rainy River First Nations has put on for 40 years. And it amazes me, after all of the times where we've really gotten off track in our relationship, that for 40 years, they've been inviting non-Indigenous people and Indigenous people, whoever, refugees, Syrians, they don't really care, to come and be their guests on the First Nation. And I just am enthralled with that spirit of generosity and what that means for us in this region going forward, to have people that can just really demonstrate what it means to be good neighbors. And I'll end for now before we can take some questions and comments with a story of what it means to be good neighbors. And Jim mentioned Donald Young. And Donald Young was a doctor in Emo, and where Jim and I both went to school. The school was named after Donald Young. So you've got all kinds of stuff named after Bacchus. You got stuff named after J.A. Matthew, stuff, and then Donald Young. Well, my grandpa told this story in 1955. The school was closing at the Manitou, and there was a big public meeting in Emo above what is now the Tompkins Hardware. There was a big public space there, and a lot of people in town were concerned that the Indians were coming to school in Emo. And my grandpa told a story that this very dignified woman stood up, and he was a pretty good storyteller, so my grandpa Loney, and she had a big hat on and the fancy gloves, and she spoke perfect English. And she said, I'm going to say something that's racist here, but there's a purpose to the story. She said, I don't want those dirty Indians coming to school with my kids. And Donald Young stood up and said, ma'am, I have been in all of their houses, and I have been in your house. And their houses are cleaner than yours. And that was the end of it. And Emo knew to get its act together, and that Donald Young School was going to welcome the kids from the Rainy River First Nations. And so now when I see the name Donald Young, I think that's what it means to be a good settler, to stand up and say when things are not right, and to celebrate when we do get it right. And there's lots of great examples of stories about when we get it right. A fantastic story about Jim and Willie Wilson helping save hundreds, thousands of pounds of meat in Stratton. That's an awesome story. But my favorite story in the whole book is that Jim and Cecil Wilson entered a canoe race in Barwick. So Cecil was the reeve of Barwick. And no one knew that they stuffed a motor and a gas tank in the bottom of their canoe. So I think it's at the very back of the book. And so that's funny. But what's even funnier is that they came third. They didn't even come first. So yeah, we're glad that you came tonight, and I think we've got some time for questions, comments, and you'll see an email address in there, manidooziibi@gmail.com, that we know you have stories about the Rainy River, about our shared history, and we didn't attempt to get all the stories here. This is a selection, so please send us some of your thoughts and recollections. And Jim's informed me that we might be doing a round 2 of this, and so we want to collect those stories. So yeah, any questions or comments anyone would like to make about Manidoo Ziibi? Yes. 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 I would say 3. My dad would be a 3rd. Yes. Glenn, I never met, but Jim, you can maybe talk about what we mentioned about Glenn here. And Smokey, yeah, Smokey took me around originally, and he's the one that said Manidoo Ziibi. And I think I heard Al Hunter say that too. So it was an interesting connection. But I'll let Jim talk about Glenn.
Glenn Jourdain was from Couchiching, and he passed away a couple of years ago. and he was a great friend of mine. And he was talking one day to me about, we worked at the time at the tribal council, and just on the third floor of the Nanakos building. And he says, I can recall this used to be the little boys' sleeping quarters, I guess. And he says, across, looking through the window, and he was pointing and he towards Couchiching. And he said, I was here as a little boy, 5 or 6. I was 5 or 6 years old at the time, and I was sent to the residential school. And every night before I went to bed, I looked out the window and I could see my mom and dad working outside the house. But I could never understand why I couldn't talk to them or go visit them. So he was away. He was separated from them for months and months and months at a time, you know. And he said, I missed them so much, I would cry myself to sleep every night. And thinking back, just how horrible that would be for a 5 or 6 year old kid to see his parents, but there was no way he could talk to them or even go over there and hug them or anything, you know. And that was just an awful situation. And that's one of the stories we have in the book. And and there's many stories like that. So, Shaun?
On page 19, in 1929, the local Indian agent reported that, quote, the children were not being properly fed and clothed and were also freezing in the school. A school inspector in October 1930 wrote of St. Margaret's that the sleeping quarters were unsatisfactory. Some 45 to 50 girls are accommodated in dormitory, which can scarcely provide sufficient cubic feet of airspace for such a number. This is from Indian agents that are reporting these conditions in our community. And yeah, so for Glenn to be able to see his family out the window and not be able to see them is something I think that's important to remember when we see people that are struggling, that just maybe they've gone through some things that we haven't. And to show a little bit of kindness is important. So thank you for acknowledging. Yeah, my dad, even in his dementia, would ask, when's that book coming out? He just loved the river, and we would paddle on it when we were kids. And my sister and I have both dumped canoes in the Manitou Rapids, and have lots of memories with our dad along the river as well. Any other questions or comments? Yeah. Yeah, so the comment was about Robert Pither, and if you go to the point, there's a historical plaque there that mentions about his civic service. But interestingly, it doesn't mention that he was expropriated from the park that we named after him. So it is interesting. Part of our history, and something that I was quite surprised to find out. And Mike, you can tee up some observations here in a minute too, if you like. I'll give you any other questions or comments. Any stories about the Rainy River that you'd like to share? Sherry might have an observation. She was a curator at the museum when we started this project, and was a constant support through the whole process, and did some early copy editing. And why I say early is because I'm sure there are some typos in here, but we would have made those after she looked at the book. So Mike or Sherry, do you have any observations about the project? Thank you. And Mike has paddled the Rainy River. He entered a canoe race in 1974 from Rainy River to Fort Francis. Not too bright, I would say. And my sister actually found a map, and we describe it in here about the back way. So the voyageurs used to go across Lake of the Woods and around what's now Nestor Falls, and eventually down Clearwater and into Northwest Bay of Rainy Lake to avoid paddling up the Rainy River. They would go and there's some portaging in there as well. And you've taken people on canoe trips, lots of kids up and down the Rainy River as well. Very nice. There's a fun section at the back, page 105. There's a picture of a dog with an axe handle for a snout. There's a campground in Minnesota on the upper Little Fork called the Axe Handle Hound Campground. And that dog will eat your axe handle if you leave it out overnight. It's $20 a night if you want to go camping there. So we found some really fun things. Some of them you may have heard of before, and some of them maybe not. We had a few people tell us that at one time the La Valley River was listed as the crookedest river in the world. And I could not find that reference, but I could not resist putting it in there either. The bottom of page 104, the last full paragraph there, this is fascinating to me. There are still visible ancient hand-dug canals connecting the Sturgeon River, this is in Minnesota, to the Tamarack River. And both the sturgeon and tamarack are tributaries to, I think it's the Big Fork River. So that water runs into the Rainy River. Cade Ferris, who's an Ojibwe anthropologist, states, this enabled the Ojibwe to go from the Rainy River to Red Lake. And by Red Lake, they mean Red Lake in Minnesota, and over the continental watersheds without taking their canoes out of the water. I think that is also fascinating. And you can still go and see these hand dug canals in Minnesota. What else did we come across before we can wind things up? Oh yes, there is kind of a neat, we were collecting Ojibwe words that we all know, and Ondig, Fiona's son, helped us put this together as well. On page 103, there is all these names that we know. So my brother-in-law Ralph is here, and he lives near Wausau Lake, and Wausau in Ojibwe means far away. So that's kind of cool that and Rainy River, I would have thought was some derivation of an Ojibwe word, but the word rainy is actually from, it's a translation of a Cree word. So when La Vérendrye came here, he didn't find Ojibwe, he found Cree. It was the Cree and maybe the Dakota. The Ojibwe were in the area, but not exactly right here. And the Cree and the Ojibwe are related. Their language is similar and would have been connected at one time. But when I now think of the word rainy, it's a reminder that the Cree were here before all of us. So I think that's kind of another interesting tidbit. Yeah, and Couchiching means so the word rainy is from the mist of then you'll see this amazing picture in the book, what Couchiching Falls looked like before it was dammed up. That's a big drop, and you could hear the water miles down the river on a quiet day. And so the Cree were capturing the mist falling, the rainy river. It's got nothing to do with the weather. It was about the Couchiching Falls. Any other questions or comments or stories? You guys are pretty quiet. Nice, nice.
Father Dan and Mom Rose, and they would cut the wood, and he had this pulpwood truck, and he would carry their wood into Port Francis to the pulp and paper mill. And he just told us lots of stories. And they sometimes, like Jim said, that they were very poor. Well, we were poor as well, but we had this farm. And sometimes the people, my dad, just the type of person that he was, I suppose, would he'd share the meat or the canning that we had and the vegetables. And within a few days, sometimes weeks or months, or maybe in the summertime, we would always get fish. They would always return fish or berries or whatever. We have pictures of Jim. I don't know if you remember this, but we would go for picnics along the river as well with your family. And I remember when my dad passed away, Harold McGinnis, I worked at the hospital and I worked with Janet, both nurses, and Harold McGinnis, when he was in the hospital, and my dad had passed away shortly before, and he said, Peggy, he said, you'll never be without a dad. He said, if you allow me, I'd like to be your dad. I'd fill in for your dad. He was a wonderful man. So.
those are the kind of stories that could you send that into our email address, manidooziibi@gmail.com. We didn't have any troubles getting that email address. No one had taken it before. Right. Yes, yeah, that could be where it comes from. Yes. Any other questions or comments as you're seeing some of these stories? There's a picture of J.A. Matthews gates on page 67. I've had driven by them many times on the River Road. That when you go by there now, you'll know, oh, this is where the Little Fork First Nation was. That's what I think of when I go by. And yeah, we were also, I wanted to also mention about the Wolseley expedition on page 70. The Rainy River is very much a thoroughfare going from east to west. And I had known that the Métis were angry in Manitoba because in the Manitoba Act, it specifically states that they would receive 1.4 million acres, which was basically the land that they're already on. And they were angry that there were surveyors were being sent out by the government of Canada. And so to stop the uprising, the government of Canada sent the Wolseley expedition. So there's a whole neighborhood in Winnipeg called Wolseley. And you'll hear a lot of people want to change the name. Well, Wolseley came down this Dawson Road that hadn't really existed before, and with 1,200 soldiers. And they got to Couchiching Falls, and there was an Ojibwe chief there named Crooked Neck. And this will tell you the military might of the Ojibwe at the time that the treaties were negotiated. And it's really important to understand that these treaties were hard bargained. It took 3 years to negotiate Treaty 3. That was tough, hard bargaining. Anyways, Wolseley's coming through, 1,200 soldiers, fully armed, cannons. And Crooked Neck said, no, you will go no further until a treaty is negotiated. And they knew they could not force their way through the area. And Crooked Neck held them here at Fort Frances until they agreed to negotiate the treaty, which was they started negotiating the following year. So we tell that story as well. And can you imagine being at Manitou and you're fishing and 1,200 soldiers go by? Like, what a sight that would have been as well. So lots of things happened on the river. Anyways, anybody for another comment? And if not, we'll call it an evening. The Natalie is selling books there. The books belong to Kenachi Winong, and they will be available in bookstores soon, but probably not until the new year. So if you're buying them for Christmas presents, you better get them tonight. You want to say anything to finish up? He doesn't want to say, and I've learned to just do whatever he tells me to do. So including more cowboys, less Indian. So thank you very much for coming. It means a lot that you're as interested in we are and listening to what Manidoo Ziibi has to tell us. Thanks for coming.
Thank you guys so much for coming, and thank you so much to Jim and Shaun for joining us. We will be having more events as part of this series. Don't have any dates on that yet, so keep an eye on our website, and there is food back there. And thank you guys again.